You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron, live with Ethan Hristodoulou.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Greeks Gridiron. I am Ethan Hristodoulou, and today, my Jacksonville Jaguars fans, I am looking at your team and how I would like to see them attack free agency this year. So make sure you comment down below. Let me know. Who do you want to see the team let go? Who do you think they must re-sign? A player maybe you want, or two that you want to see them go after in this year's free agency period. All of that. We'll dive right in. And excuse my voice if I sound a little bit off. I'm dealing with something right now, a little bit sick. So just bear with me as we kind of roll our way through this video. But starting off with the first thing we must mention here, the Jaguars, $18.8 million over the cap. So they have some work to do. And with that in mind, I do think it's going to cost them a player or two going into this free agency market just because of being cap casualties and whatnot. And somebody that I expect to see them let go more so because I'm seeing a slightly higher than I would have thought projection from Spotrac on this one here. But he has been a solid, serviceable guy. He played all 19 possible games last year. Is going to be defensive end Arden Key. He's 26, approaching 27 years old. He had 20 pressures, 4.5 sacks. He had 27 tackles last year as well. And like I mentioned, all 19 games possible played. So he was healthy, he was there, he was available, and he produced as well. He's been a very solid player the last couple of seasons in San Francisco. He even had himself 19 pressures, 6.5 sacks, and 22 tackles last season. And while that's all great, and he's, again, been a really solid player, he kind of feels like he might end up being a cap casualty just because of how good he's been the last couple of seasons. Again, he was only here for this 1 year in Jacksonville, and I think that just with the fact that the projections are, again, a little bit higher than I would have expected. The Spotrac has him listed for 2 years, $11.3 million per year. I don't know if he's worth quite that much, but even on, like, say, the low end, if he's signing a 2-year deal somewhere along the lines of like $7 to $9 million a season, I think ultimately you're staring at just a little bit too much money for a team that needs to find some money. And I'm not going to sit here and act like the Jaguars don't have a pretty impressive pairing of young pass rushers already on the edge. So Arden Key seems more like a luxury than a necessity. And if I had to expect them to do anything with him, I would expect them to just let him walk ultimately and maybe look elsewhere for the depth behind Josh Allen and, excuse me, Trayvon Walker. So that's kind of how I look at things in terms of somebody I expect to see them let go. Now, looking at somebody that I want to see them re-sign, and I think this is going to be key to sustaining the success of the offense here, is going to be bringing back right tackle Jawaan Taylor. This is definitely going to be a little bit of a pricey endeavor, but someone that I think will be key to keeping this offensive line intact, keeping the synergy, the chemistry, all of that together, which I think is huge for offensive lines and something that gets a little bit forgotten about sometimes. I feel like a lot of people think you can go out and just sign a really good player and then plug them right into an offensive line, but I feel like I can always go back to the Colts on this one here. You looked at such a great offensive line for the last few seasons prior to like the last couple, but then once Anthony Costanzo retired, being such a massive piece to that very left side of the offensive line, I feel like the chemistry and just how well that group has gelled kind of fell apart. And so that's kind of how I look at offensive lines now. Like, yes, you can have great players, but how well do they gel? How well do they play together? And I feel like with how good the Jaguars offensive line was this last year, you want to keep that together, and bringing back Jawaan Taylor will be huge. He only allowed 5 sacks last season in 3 games. The rest of the games, nobody was getting by him. And in those 3 games, 2 of them were against the Chiefs and the Eagles, where he let up a couple of sacks each and then a 5th sack in another game. But I mean, if you're letting up 2 sacks in a game to anybody, it might as well be the team that was first and second in terms of sacks scored this year. So not necessarily bad by any means. Spotrac has him marked up for like a 4-year, $14 million deal or so. So while I do think that's going to be a lot of money to try to find and be able to give to him, I think it is very important to keep your offensive line together as much as possible. Again, I look at the Colts and losing just a left tackle and how much that hurt that team altogether. I think that it's going to be important for the Jaguars if they want to sustain such good success on offense and ensure the positive growth of Trevor Lawrence and the offense as a whole. Keep the group together. You must. I mean, you spent the 2nd-round pick on the guy in 2019. You've gotten the production and maybe even a little bit more out of him, especially this last year. Pay the guy. Keep your offensive line intact. I think it'll be really good for you guys in the long run here. And $14 million a year is not necessarily that much in comparison to what some of the top tackles can be making, where you're looking at like 17, 18 for top right, I believe. And then it's like you're looking at like 20 plus for top left tackles. So 14 million a year, not necessarily bad in terms of where the market actually is for right tackles. Now, let's take a look at who I would like to see the Jaguars go after. A lot of really good talent on the team, a lot of young talent at that. So it was a little bit harder for me to find people that I really felt like they needed to go after. But one area of need that I think the Jaguars need to focus on, especially in this passing league that we're looking at these days, is going to be improving a little bit of the interior defensive line. I think beefing them up and adding some proven pressure from players that have not necessarily been like superstars, but guys that work on the inside and get the job done and can be effective for you should definitely help this team, especially considering you have two what are supposed to be premier edge rushers in Josh Allen and Trayvon Walker. So with that in mind, I'm looking at interior defensive lineman Kalen Saunders. 9 pressures last year. He had 3.5 sacks, 48 tackles, and 16 games played. He was only playing 39% of possible snaps last year, and Spotrac has him projected for not a very large number, 2 years, $6.4 million. You might even be able to get him for a little bit less than that. It might end up being a little bit more, but somewhere around that ballpark. If you can get it closer to like that $6 million mark than the $7 million mark, that would be ideal. But in a passing league where you want to get as much pressure and make quarterbacks as uncomfortable as possible, this one kind of makes sense to me, especially for a team that, again, you don't really have a ton of money to spend, and you're currently right now working on clearing out some of the cap space so you can get under that number there. You're going to have to obviously restructure some contracts. You're going to have to hand out some more not guaranteed money, like not signing bonuses either, just like cash money is what I'm trying to say here. And so with that in mind, I think bringing in a guy like him who, again, playing at only about 40 snaps last year and to net 3.5 sacks, I believe he had about 400 total snaps altogether. So you're looking at like one sack, per snap. Wow, I'm like juggling words right now, but that's not bad. That's not bad production at all. If he's playing a little bit more of a prominent role and he's in the rotation a little bit more, because I feel like he has proved himself that at this point you might be able to get a little bit more out of him if he's playing a little bit more through that rotation. I wouldn't mind this signing for the Jaguars. And again, this is more of a, how can we help out the two premier edge rushers that we have on the outside, and by beefing up the interior and creating a little bit more pressure from the inside, things could open up a little bit more. Teams obviously have to worry about that interior pressure a little bit more, and hopefully that opens up the edges to gain a little bit more leverage, get some more sacks, even just create more pressure to make those quarterbacks uncomfortable. Couple that with the fact that Kalen Saunders, I believe, he's on KC. And with how much money KC has invested on some of their top end players here, and especially on the defensive line, you think of like Frank Clark and you feel like Chris Jones. I mean, there's just an awful lot of money already going on that defensive front. This feels like a prime candidate for somebody who might end up having to walk, especially if he's going to be making somewhere around that like $6.5 million per year, potentially even more mark. If the Chiefs are a little bit worried about how high that number could go, I feel like this is a reasonable guy you could expect in free agency. And again, a solid pickup for the Jaguars here, who don't have a ton of money, but could look to improve the pass rush a little bit by bringing in a guy who had some solid numbers despite very limited play. But that is how I'm looking at the Jaguars free agency. I would love to hear from you all Jaguars fans. Let me know what y'all think in the comment section down below. I appreciate y'all for watching if you made it to the end. I will see you all next time. Have a good one.